So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to meeting some of you next week as well during office hours. Just to give you a little bit of background, I have been in the life sciences industry for about 34 years. I started when I was 5, and I actually started in the biotech and pharmaceutical world. At that time, I was part of the interferon launch team at Schering-Plough, which is now part of Merck. And it was a time when we didn't have a method for a biotech or a chemotherapy product to even be really purchased by a doctor and administered in the doctor's office and reimbursed by a health insurance company. There was no methodology for that because traditionally that had always happened on an inpatient basis in the hospital. And really, when you think back about how insurance grew up, with the Medicare and the Medicaid program in particular, in the mid-1960s, you know, insurance was really designed to be a system that allowed you to be hospitalized for really that last illness that pretty much killed you. And you know, it started when you were 65 at a time when the life expectancy was 67 for men and 68 for women. So it was never supposed to be something that you had for this extended period of time. So in the 1980s, when interferon and all the growth factors were being developed in the biotech world, suddenly it was safe to give products to people in the doctor's office outside of the inpatient setting. And there was no method for that to happen and get reimbursed. And so we were very grassroots back then, knocking on insurance companies' door, going down to the Medicare program to meet with them to come up with a method so that that was available to patients. And that's really how it all started. And so, you know, it was back in the days, there were no therapeutic devices. Devices were, you know, catheters. They were, you know, bedpans. There were no therapeutic devices back in those days. So, you know, the field, of course, has really grown up and morphed. And so when we think about health insurance, and particularly the Medicare and the Medicaid program, you know, I always like to remind people, they seem like they don't make sense. But they did make sense in 1965. And because they are not things, they are not places, they are not businesses, they are laws. They don't go away. We just amend them over and over and over again. So there are artifacts that don't really work for the way we experience healthcare delivery today. But there are things that you have to have a mindset about, because as you develop your own products, you need to appreciate the fact that there are places in the system that aren't very bendable or haven't yet caught up, because it requires this process. So I just want you to keep that in the back of your head as we go forward. All right, so why are we talking about this? Well, obviously, you know, we live in a world of financial transactions, and for a life sciences product, a medical device, a biologic or a pharmaceutical or a clinical laboratory test, imaging test, you know, they're all, and even health IT, we depend on how providers get funded and how they have a flow of money to buy your technologies, and how, you know, everybody thinks payers are the ones that pay for everything, and in fact that's not the case. So we're going to talk about how that money sort of flows and things you have to think about. And where your product fits. Who is the purchaser? Who takes financial risk when they buy your product? When do you start planning for all of this? When do you need to know this about your product so that you can incorporate it into your business plan? And understanding the difference between how payment happens and how purchasing happens, because they're two completely different things. And knowing how to ask the right questions. And the reason you need to know what the right questions are, even before you know what the answers are, because you have investors, you will need investors, and investors ask a lot of reimbursement questions, not always the right reimbursement questions, because they know a finite set of them to ask. And you need to be able to say, I know you're concerned about reimbursement. I'd like to reframe that, because this is what reimbursement means to my product. So if you don't know the questions to ask, you won't know they're asking the wrong ones. And if you start trying to answer the wrong questions, it's a good way for the investment community to walk away from you. So, or they come to me and ask me, and I tell them the right answer, and then they walk away from you. So it's important to be aware of how your product fits into the space. So, it used to be when we first started, there were mostly drugs. And, at the time reimbursement mattered, it was biologics, the fancy, and chemotherapy drugs. Then medical devices became more therapeutic. And those are the things that we think about in sort of the classic reimbursement sense, things that payers have to address. Now there are disease management programs, there are health IT programs that make payers and providers more efficient. And while they're not classic in the reimbursement universe as we see it, they are very much impacted by how reimbursement happens. So I know some of you may have some of those kinds of products, so I'll try to weave that in and be sure to ask me questions at the end if something confused you. So, the classic question is, will my device or drug or diagnostic or whatever it might be get reimbursed? I mean, that's one of the first questions the investment community tends to ask life sciences companies now. And so what does getting to yes mean, and what is reimbursement? Traditionally we think of reimbursement as just the payment piece. And it used to be, everything got itemized on a bill and it got paid on an itemized list. And now everything is based on sort of an episode of care, getting paid on a global basis or a prospective basis. And there are many new payment methodologies. People are very concerned about how ACOs function in the new payment environment, and are they going to replace existing payments? And in fact, it's just another way. It's not replacing anything, it's just adding to. And then being able to talk about your value proposition. Probably a lot of you are trying to understand what the value proposition is for your product, how you're going to sell it, and why it's important for someone to buy it. And one of the important differentials between sort of in the reimbursement space and that whole value proposition is value proposition is very much a purchasing issue. It's about expressing and getting someone to buy from you, whereas payment is not a value-based system. We don't have a health insurance system that pays based on value. It pays based on work and resource utilization and consumption. So you have to play in both of those universes, and you have to understand for your customer how to translate that value proposition so that they can make a purchasing decision. But in doing that, you need to appreciate that how they get paid, where they get their money, is not in that same language. It's very much utilitarian, and you have to marry those two things together. So obviously that means this is going to happen at every stage of development. Investors are going to start asking you questions, and sometimes, again, you don't need to know the answers at a very early stage, but you do need to understand why they're asking what they're asking. Eventually, providers, hospitals, doctors, the healthcare community that is going to purchase your technology, they're the ones that take a lot of the financial risk now based on the new payment methodologies. So everybody comes to us and they say, oh, well, we need to go meet with payers. And I'm like, well, what do you need to meet with them about? And it's like, oh, so they're going to buy our product. It's like, they're not the purchaser. It's the hospital that's the purchaser. You need to make that argument to them. Patients increasingly are paying more and more out of pocket for technology, and they're becoming prudent purchasers of healthcare. I don't know if you've looked at your own health plans recently, but you have a $2,000 deductible, and you really need to read the fine print to figure out what goes against that deductible. And it's usually clinical lab tests, in vitro diagnostics, imaging diagnostics. There are things that then you're going to get a bill for when it happens. And so patients are very much part of that equation now. So when you think about all of that, reimbursement really needs to figure fairly prominently in your early stage development. We used to see this little reimbursement bubble, used to sit outside of that circle. It was really marketing. It was a little piece of marketing that happened after the product got all the way through the FDA. And now really it needs to be right in line with that whole FDA experience, because how the FDA regulates your product can have a lot of implications for reimbursement. So you need to understand what the medical community and the payer community is going to want from a clinical perspective, not just to get through FDA, but to actually successfully commercialize. So all of that has to be weaved into your business plan early on. When we think about sort of classic reimbursement's really an umbrella term. There's a primary three-legged stool that provide the components that we call reimbursement. Coverage is really, for most therapeutic products, the most important thing, because coverage is what defines access. It's the policies that say you have to have red hair and blue toenails to get this technology, to be eligible for it. You have to meet the following conditions, and those conditions typically are driven right out of your clinical trial. Your evidence tells the story about who the target patient population is that's going to be best suited to the product. So payers don't let everybody get it, and there are conditions. Coding is often misperceived to be the most important part of that stool, and while it is a critical driver, and it is a question investors always ask, do you have a code, do you have a code, do you have a code? It is language. It translates what happened to the patient, what's wrong with the patient, to a procedure, to a payment. It links all of the things together. And it can definitely make reimbursement complicated if you don't have one, or you don't have quite the right one, or you need a new one. It can make the whole process more complex, but if you don't have coverage, it doesn't matter if there's a code or even if there's a payment assigned. If you don't have coverage, there will be nothing. No one will have access to your technology. Payment is actually the remuneration for the services that were rendered, and it can come in many forms. It's usually for an entire medical encounter now if it happens in the hospital setting. And health economics is sort of the flow of marrying sort of the costs related to the technology and that value proposition to how payment happens for whoever it takes financial risk, which may not be the payer, and in this country is not society. In this country, we don't use health economics for decision making, very important. A lot of people come to us and say, oh, we need to do a cost effectiveness model. And really mostly if you're doing it for the United States, you don't. It's interesting information. Generally, we model things in this country, and it's not really based on good prospective data. And so it's often not something you really need to have in your early stage development. So lots of different payment models. We talked about that. We haven't, taken anything away. We've just introduced new ways of thinking about how we can pay for things. And we have to marry all of that together. The whole sort of classic, you have to do coverage, coding, and payment to operationalize getting your product commercialized and in the reimbursement world. And then you have to marry it to the sort of the economics of how the financial cost accounting of how hospitals and other providers work. So, importantly, this is maybe something you all know, but getting FDA approval or clearance for your device or your drug, or if you have a software application, you may be exempt from needing any of these things, does not mean that you are approved from a payer perspective. It does not mean that payers will agree to cover, that you will get a code, or that it will be a paid service. So very important. FDA, whatever process you need to go through there, gives you permission to put a product on the shelf, and it's the starting point. How many of you have a device that may be 510K cleared? Do you know? Okay. So how many of you have a drug or a biologic that's going to go all the way through the CBER/CDER process? Nobody. Wow. How about a PMA device? No one. One? Okay. How about health IT? A couple people. Okay. So a 510K really doesn't require much in the way of clinical evidence. Pretty much you have to show that you're similar to something that already exists. So you're out there. But what that means is there are other things that are out there that are like you. And if you're going out there with more bells and whistles, you probably want to charge more money for your device, right? So then you have to think about, well, how am I going to get more money from my device when really we've just told everybody we're just like everything else that's in this category? So that's a challenge. And so that's a common issue that we have to deal with, to define how you can create a reimbursement plan for your product that helps to express the value and helps hospitals purchase it when there may not be more money in the system. I'm not going to go through this, but I will tell you that when I first drew a payer chart about probably 25 years ago, it was really tiny. It was just a couple of little arms, and now it's falling off the slide. Because part of why is because it used to be that payers were just Blue Cross Blue Shield of something, and Medicare and Medicaid. We didn't really think about, at that time there were no hybrid models where providers became payers and health systems had insurance products. None of that existed. So the lines are very fuzzy now, and that's why we always say when you follow the money, think about who's taking financial risk, because often they're the decision makers. And then when you think about who's taking financial risk, that's the purchaser. And for many of you, you need to think beyond how you're going to sell your product to an individual customer. I mean, that's very important. But when hospitals are making purchasing decisions, you may have a device that costs, a couple $1,000s, a couple $100s, not a lot of money. But when you are trying to sell that device to partners that has, 35 hospitals and lots of physician practices, they have standards and protocols internally that helps them be efficient. It helps them manage quality measures. It helps them assure that when they're creating a contract with the payer, that they're getting the best possible contract because they meet those efficiency standards. And so they're making a decision not based on a product that costs a couple of $100s, but rather on a product that they're going to bring into their whole system and really may be a multi-million-dollar purchase for them. So you not only have to think about your pricing from the perspective of what an individual reimbursement on a patient-by-patient is going to look at, but how the purchaser is going to view that, because they're going to say, well, am I getting reimbursed for this product? So you have to be able to translate that information into their big purchasing decision. Okay. So I'm going to take a break and then see if there are any quick questions before I jump into some of the mechanics. No? Okay.
When you just started mentioning the history of, at that time, were vaccinations in doctors' offices reimbursed?
Oh, wow. I mean, back then, most of the vaccinations happened to infants. And so you did get them in the pediatrician's office. So it was pretty standard back then. Whether they were reimbursed or not, it depends on when. Certainly in the 1970s and 80s they were, because we had more sophisticated health insurance then. Prior to that, it was probably some were and some weren't.
Was this a precedent of a procedure in a doctor's office to be reimbursed, right?
Vaccinations are different because they are a public health service, so we don't really put them in the same category as traditional, like a chemotherapy drug, for example, that would be based on a specific diagnosis. So coverage, when we think about coverage, when we think about the reimbursement stool, coverage is an evidence-based process. This is where your clinical trials really matter. FDA requires a certain set of requirements for demonstrating safety and efficacy to allow your product to be marketed. And they're usually confined to a very small world. Patients who meet a very confined set of conditions under very controlled circumstances. Payers are very interested in what happens in the real world when doctors go off the ranch and treat patients who have no other options and who don't meet all those little clinical conditions or may have pre-existing conditions that were excluded in the trial. So all of the data you have about a product starts to matter when you think about how doctors and payers will start to make decisions. And so, when we think about evidence, it's not just evidence you have on file, but it's really peer-reviewed evidence, publications, things that have been really vetted in the clinical community. So again, even if the FDA doesn't require that you do a very robust clinical trial, there may be times when you need to produce that level of evidence to satisfy what payers need and what providers need to actually adopt the technology. Coverage is often formalized into policy. Not all products require a coverage decision. Some products are truly part of the mechanics of doing a procedure, or they support a procedure that really is the primary procedure that would be covered. So certain types of catheters, for example, don't require a coverage decision because they are used in the context of putting in a pacemaker or a defibrillator or some other sort of device. But when your when your product starts to move into becoming that part of that therapeutic space and really defining the procedure itself, that's when coverage becomes important. So not only do you have to think about what's happened with your technology, but products that are similar that have come before you. So if you have a radiofrequency ablation probe, and there are many of them out there, they ablate soft tissue of various types, but you're going to use yours in a new way. You might be able to get a 510K for your RFA device because there are predicates on the market. But because you're using it in a different application, let's say you're going to ablate a bone tumor, and right now radiofrequency ablation devices are primarily used for liver and renal tumors. That's a treatment. That becomes a treatment, and that's the kind of thing that payers are going to want to make a decision about based on your evidence. That's the kind of thing that is going to require that level of decision making. So FDA is not going to require that you do a big clinical trial to get a general clearance for an RFA ablation probe, because they're out there already. You just have to prove that it behaves in a similar way and it's safe, and you're cleared to market your product. But there's really not going to be a methodology for that procedure to be covered and reimbursed because it hasn't existed before. So that's a good example of where that clinical evidence is going to be important. And so when you think about coverage, and if you're defining when your product needs coverage, is important up front, because these processes, and I'm not going to go through, this is the Medicare National Coverage Decision process. Medicare makes local decisions. Their process is pretty similar, just takes a slightly less amount of time. Private payers don't even look at new technologies and treatments till they've been on the market at least 6 months, sometimes a year. They won't even really consider coverage in a broad way. So the reason I show you this is because people come to us and they show us very complex and presumably very worthwhile technologies. And then we ask them about their adoption curve and what kinds of estimations they're making about forecasting and scaling up and their timelines, so that we can help factor in the reimbursement timelines to their business timelines. And of course, we see the ramp, the hockey stick ramp. And no one has considered the fact that it could take 18 months to 2 years for there really to be widespread coverage for a new product. So, and that if you haven't created the right level of evidence and you don't know how payers are going to think about that evidence ahead of time, you could be, we see people who try to come to market, and we get a call and it's 3 months prior to, they're getting ready to submit their 510K. And so in approximately 90 to 120 days, they could commercialize their product. And they really believe it can happen that fast. So it's important to keep these timelines in mind. So when you think about where to start and when to start, early. How many of you are familiar with coding or have been asked about coding related to your products? Has anybody asked you that question? What kind of question did you get asked? And who asked it? Investors, right. And what did they say? Do you have a code? Was it pretty much that simple? Yeah. Anybody else? Same thing? You too?
If it's a diagnostic, if it's a treatment, so they ask you, like, if you know the CPT code, the GRE code, the...
You have a CPT code, right? So that's a very common question. Codes take on heightened importance because it's something you can look up in a book. And so you know and people think that all the information about codes is just in the code book, and that's not true. There are many types of code. And it's important to know if your product needs a code and what type of code, because there are so many. There are diagnosis codes. Most manufacturers of life sciences products don't have to get into the business of diagnosing. You're not doctors or providers. Well, some of you might be, but if you're not treating a patient, you're not making a diagnosis. And so the World Health Organization pretty much has diagnosis codes covered. They come in the form of, right now, ICD-9, CM. They're transitioning to ICD-10 in October. We will finally catch up with the rest of the G8 that has been on ICD-10 for a number of years now. It's a very refined coding system, very specific. Typically, when investors ask questions, they're asking about CPT procedure codes because they tend to be the most complex to get, and they're the codes that define physician services and now hospital services, outpatient services, and ambulatory surgery center services. So they're very tedious to get. They are managed by the AMA, not by Medicare or the government. And they're also part of an evidence-based decision-making process. HCPCS codes are pretty common if you have a pharmaceutical product that is administered in the hospital or the doctor's office. And then there are ICD-9, soon-to-be ICD-10 procedure codes that are only used to define hospital inpatient services. So you may need more than one code to define your product at the end of the day. So, or you may not need any because there are already codes to describe the procedure where your product is involved. So again, there are more processes, and I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but CPT codes are very complex. There are a couple of types. Category 1, which are the codes we typically see, they're the ones that actually have a payment attached to them. Once the code is assigned by the AMA, it goes through a process where it's valued, and there's a payment attached to it that is created by another division of the AMA for physician services, and it's assigned a payment by usually the Medicare system and private payers for the facility. Category 3 codes denote experimental and investigational products. That does not mean it's a product that has not yet been approved by FDA or cleared by FDA. There are many new, especially 510K technologies that end up in this Category 3 space. They have some negative connotations because payers believe they're experimental and investigational, and they often don't cover them because they feel like if the AMA didn't believe they were ready for prime time, they shouldn't be covered and paid for. So if you need a code, this is a process that takes about 2 years. If you don't have a code and you can use unlisted codes or Category 3 codes, and it kind of gums up the work. Codes allow the operations of the claims to go through. So when there isn't a code, payers come back and want to know more information about what happened. And that's where they start to make individual decisions and often make a non-coverage decision about a new technology because they see that it really either doesn't have a Category 1 code, it's not really ready for prime time, and there's no payment attached to it. So often that's a reason for them to decide not to pay. HCPCS codes are a little more straightforward. They take about a year to get. There is a calendar year application process. And because coding translates to how the system is operationalized, it's very important to know what your products need and when you're going to need to submit applications, what the strategy behind your application is. It's not just filling out paperwork, because the way you fill it out, what you're asking for will make a difference for payment, because that's how the code will eventually translate to payment. From a payment perspective, how do you think products get paid for now? What kind of methodology? Anybody have any experience? If you have a medical, you have a 510K device, that's what you're hoping for? do you have any idea of what kind of payment methodology? That's why you're here, okay. So generally, medical devices are not separately reimbursed. They're not itemized on a bill. Payers don't often know which brand of device is used for an individual patient, and they're not really interested in that information. Just like for a drug, if two companies have the same drug, they're only interested in that generic information on a claim form. They're not going to be in the business of selecting individual technologies typically. And more, payment is based on an episode of care or an encounter. And there's a single payment that represents that entire encounter. So when you add something new to that encounter, it does not necessarily translate into an increase in payment. Sometimes if it's just an integral piece of the pie, the payment stays the same. But the way prospective payment systems are designed are to assure that sort of on average, the provider is kept whole. So when a hospital, is buying technologies for the inpatient setting or for a patient that's going to be admitted to the hospital for a procedure or a surgical episode, a total hip implant, for example, the hospital has free rein to decide which hip they use. They can use Zimmer's hip, they can use Biomet's hip, it's really up to them. The payment isn't going to change because they decide on this patient they're going to use a slightly more expensive hip than that patient. The goal is that as they look at a cohort of patients across all the patients that they do a total hip replacement on in that hospital, in general the hospital stays whole. So they're going to potentially lose some on some patients and make some on other patients, and in general break even. Incrementally over time, hospitals file claims to payers and they file claims to the government for Medicare patients, and they report their costs in a cost reporting methodology every quarter. And incrementally, payments creep up as new technologies and services are added to the pie. But in general, we see that when you add a great big new technology into an existing payment system, it can take sometimes a few years before you start to see the payments reflect the addition of those new technologies. If you're doing something that really has never existed before, and there is no way to define it in the current payment system, then there's work to be done with the individual private payers and also with Medicare to define a payment classification for this new technology. So anyone familiar with the percutaneous heart valves, TAVI? Some of you are. This is a way to put a heart valve in without doing open heart surgery. So that's something that hadn't existed before, and there really wasn't a way to reflect that in the payment system. The individual valves actually cost about $35,000. The hospitalization for an open surgical procedure pays about $40,000, and the patient's in the hospital for about a week or more. Typically. So you can imagine the hospital's got to buy a $35,000 heart valve, and they're going to get reimbursed for that entire hospitalization, every single thing the patient got while they were in the hospital, $40,000. So for the first several years the product's been on the market, hospitals have really been eating that deficit because they felt it was important to get this technology in and offer it to patients who were not surgical candidates. They were able to apply, the company and the hospitals were able to apply for some additional funding, but it didn't make up the gap. It only made up about, maybe 40 to 50% of that differential for some patients. So now it's been about 3 years, and this year, finally, Medicare has developed a new diagnosis-related group to define percutaneous heart valve procedures, so that there is a new payment classification that is better suited to this particular procedure and more wholly reimburses this device. It still doesn't keep the hospital completely whole, but it just means that when you're thinking about how payment happens for an individual technology, there is often a period of time of anywhere from a few months to a few years where the purchaser of your technology, usually it's the hospital, it could be a doctor's office, is going to have a deficit in terms of their reimbursement. And so in terms of your strategy, that affects your pricing strategy. It affects, you don't necessarily always want to just price. If you've got a high value proposition, you don't want to price to the lowest common denominator, but you need to have a plan to support the physician community and the hospital community, to encourage them to accept that deficit in a short term, because typically after a couple of years, they will begin to see a higher level of reimbursement and begin to recoup over time. But it's a pretty common issue now when you're developing something that is truly new. So if you fall into that truly new category, it's important to have understand that payment methodology early in your development cycle, so that you can think about ways to have creative marketing programs, how to price your product effectively, to appreciate the fact that hospitals may incur you'd be able to provide other services to these patients because they're offering this more expensive one. They may be losing what a lot of the heart centers realized was that, these were patients that were not previously surgical candidates, so they were really just living in the cardiologist's office, having office visits. So once they had this procedure, they had to come back fairly frequently for other tests and other services. And the hospital realized that this was a new group of patients that became customers. So being able to demonstrate that sort of economics to the hospital customer becomes important. If you've got a new 510K device that fits into an existing payment category and you're charging more because your device is better, and you can demonstrate that it's better, you've got to make an argument to the hospital about why they should spend a little more on your device for the same amount of money. And maybe it's because the doctor can do the procedure 20 minutes faster. Minutes in the operating room or the cath lab matter. It might mean that they can have fewer side effects for the patient, or the patient is less likely to experience some sort of recurrence or failure and not come back for something that isn't going to get reimbursed. So those are the kinds of things that you need to understand. It's not always about we introduce a new device or a new drug and the money just goes up, because it often does not.
I was curious, in terms of pricing, is there a strategy where you can price it lower initially and after proving value, increase the price, or once you...
Generally not, because once it's low, because you really want your value proposition to be reflected in the payment system up front. Where pharmaceutical companies, particularly the biotech companies, got into trouble in the 1980s is that they put a product out there with we always laughed and said, there's average wholesale price, and it's really just a number you can either add to or subtract from. It really wasn't a real price, because no one ever paid that amount. No one ever paid, it's like a car, no one ever pays list price for a car. So once you've set your price, you've set your price. And so you need to be thinking about how that price is going to affect your customers at launch, and then as the reimbursement system matures, so that your price grows up in the system. Otherwise, it's always going to be low. So this is just I'm sorry.
Say the system is still maturing. How do the coding body recognize the benefits of the new device? Does the company provide them new evidence to do that, or how does that?
Do you mean the coding body or the payer, or it could be any of those people, actually? You have to provide evidence. Typically, it's peer-reviewed evidence. As a company, you're speaking through your clinical evidence. Peer-reviewed evidence is your spokesperson. You can provide that information, but ultimately, there's no reason for payers or doctors just to believe you, because you've said it. You've got to prove it. And so it could be coding people that have to make a decision about coding, but it really could be about coverage, and it could be just about physicians making purchasing decisions or decisions to adopt a product or technology. Well, the way quality measures kind of fit in, we think about readmissions and things like that. So with the DRG system, which is right here, so essentially, hospital payments are made based on what the patient's diagnosis is and what happens to them while they're in the hospital. So hospitals don't code a DRG. DRGs are not codes, they are payment groups. So this claim with the diagnosis codes and the procedure codes goes into the system, and it lands in a payment group, and that's how the hospital gets paid. If a hospital has a patient who's had pneumonia or is in heart failure and has been in the hospital and then is readmitted in 30 days, there's a penalty, a payment penalty to the hospital if they hit a percentage of patients who do that. So that's not applied directly to the DRG payment, but it's rather applied overall. It's sort of taken out of the funding across all the hospital payments over time. And that's really just for Medicare. Private payers so far have not really adopted that. But again, that goes to, if you've got a product that can potentially prevent readmissions or prevent device failures, hospitals may be willing to make that purchase because they know how much those kinds of penalties and adverse events can affect them. And they don't always get reimbursed for a redo if it's something that they did or if the device was at fault. So on the hospital outpatient ambulatory surgery side, it's sort of similar. You have diagnosis codes. They're the same. This time you're using CPT procedure codes. Sometimes if a hospital-administered drug is employed, HCPCS codes are used, and all of those things are grouped into a payment episode or a payment classification. In the physician's office, services are still reimbursed more often on a fee-for-service basis, but that's probably going to be changing soon. And then if you have a supply like a durable medical equipment or a lab test, there's usually a fee schedule involved there. So, but that's not the whole story, because it's very easy to look up a code in the code book and say, gee, we look pretty close to that code. There's a lot of code guidance that tells whether or not what you're doing meets that procedure code. So it's not quite as simple as we think we look pretty close to this description. And then once the codes are familiar to the payer in the claims system, payers do creative things like say, gee, we never see this code by itself on a claim form. It always travels with these other codes, these other procedures, and therefore we're going to call these integral procedures, and we're going to bundle them together under a single payment. So it sort of appears that things are not getting paid at all when really there's one payment to cover that entire sort of bundle of services that happens. And more frequently, even the coding is starting to bundle groups of services. For example, if you come in and you need a peripheral stent because you've got blood clots in your leg, there's a code that describes the balloon, the atherectomy, which is like the little rotor-rooter thing that goes into the vein and cleans it out, and the stent. So in some cases, doctors are like, we may as well stent because we're going to get paid the same thing. Why would we bother just doing the balloon or just doing the atherectomy? Because these services tend to be integral. So that becomes important. So it's not enough just to look up a code in the code book and then look on the Medicare website and say, oh, that's how much it gets paid, and let's add it all up, because that's not how the payment happens. So this just gives you an example of a DRG and how the diagnosis codes and the procedure codes sort of land in this particular DRG. That's the global payment for, in this case, a heart transplant. And you see the difference between the ICD-9 and the ICD-10 coding. The ICD-10 coding has many more digits and is a little bit more specific. So you've gone from insert pacemaker lead to insertion of a cardiac lead in the left ventricle percutaneous approach. So it's much more specific. So we'll be able to know a lot more about what patients got. These are just, and if you want slides, Alice is happy to send you a copy of the slides. These are office visit codes for doctors. So a lot of the services that you get in the doctor's offices are not separately reimbursed. When they do little lab tests and things like that, they may or may not be separately reimbursed. They're going to all be coded under these office visit codes, and they come in tiers. So like 99211 is really when you come in and get a quick injection and leave and you only see the nurse, versus a 99215, which is a pretty comprehensive multifactorial visit where the doctor's spending, maybe 40 or 45 minutes with you, and there's a lot of complex decision making. And even with all of that, you see the payments are not particularly high. Doctors are paid separately. So if doctors come into the hospital and deliver a service or perform a surgery, they are paid based on the facility payment because they did the work in a facility. If they did the work in their office, which means they probably had to incur cost of devices and supplies and things like that, they get a little more money. And this changes every year, or now with Congress threatening to shut down the government every quarter, payments are subject to change because the way the conversion factors work on the codes mean that the payments change pretty frequently, but they stay in the same neighborhood. Pardon?
The DRG weight.
The weight of the DRG?
Yeah.
How it's created?
Yeah.
Well, this is just the physician payments for office visits. DRG weights are valued based on resource utilization, and that's based on the cost reports that hospitals submit to the government. So they're valued based on all the supplies, all the primary procedures, all the resources that are used, labor, wage indexes. They don't price the DRG till the end. There's a valuation on the DRG first, and then based on every year, a series of financial exercises that the government goes through and the market basket indexes and the state of the economy, they create sort of a conversion factor that's multiplied by the weight, and that's how they arrive at the price. So the weights are subject to some change over the years based on changes in resource consumption. That's how the weights, how payment incrementally goes up or down when new technologies are introduced. So when you introduce a new artificial heart into the system that may be more money over time, that weight will increase because of the presence of that new device. Sure, I'm happy to. The question was how the DRG weights are changed over time to reflect payment and whether you can incrementally change them on a short-term basis. So the answer is unfortunately no. I mean, sometimes that's how, when you recognize, as the percutaneous heart valves did, that the weights under-reflected the resource consumption of the product, then it required a strategy on the part of the company to work with the government to accumulate the claims data in the system to show that there was an undervaluation and to support creating a new DRG for that product. And it took about 3 years. So, this is just an example of a standard lab test. I mean, this is, if it's performed in the doctor's office, it might be paid separately at about $11. If it's performed in a hospital outpatient setting, let's say the patient comes in for a procedure and the doctor decides to run this lab, it's a point of care test, so it's like a litmus test. It's not going to be separately reimbursed. It's going to be absorbed in the payment for the primary procedure and encounter. And then this is an example of a comprehensive service where integral services are wrapped into a single payment. So you can see this is for a level 3 electrophysiologic procedure category in the ambulatory patient classification or hospital outpatient classification. So essentially, this reflects a cardiac ablation where there's 3D mapping. And so you can see those procedures are all wrapped together, and if you have developed a 3D mapping device, heart mapping device, that procedure is not separately reimbursed. It is part of this entire $14,000 payment, or that episodic payment, because these are procedures that don't typically stand alone. You always are going to do that 3D mapping as part of this particular procedure. So that's an example of, not just looking in the code book and looking it up and saying, oh, we get paid that. Because depending on the patient encounter will change how that payment actually happens. So the magic price question. Any more questions about payment before I jump into pricing? So the question is, does your regulatory path influence the speed at which, or the level at which the government may or private payers may reimburse for a product, or whether it affects whether a product gets a new code or not. Not directly. What often happens with a PMA device or a drug or biologic that goes through a much more rigorous clinical trial process at FDA is that automatically you have a lot more evidence to support evidence-based decision-making, and you have peer-reviewed publications. Although, again, those clinical trials are often done in a way that CMS and private payers say doesn't reflect the real world in which doctors and hospitals actually use products. But you do come to the table right away with a level of evidence that exceeds what a 510K device or another, like a software application might have. You have to provide the level of evidence that's appropriate for your product. It is not appropriate for every kind of product to be required to do or provide a big randomized controlled clinical trial. It's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily change the process or speed things up. It just means that you come to the table meeting more of the criteria, maybe a little faster. Of course, the 510K is already on the market after 90 days, and they can be moving into the system a little quicker and be doing those trials on a post-market basis. So there are pros and cons either way. Does it affect how, in the case of like CPT codes, that's an AMA decision-making. Medicare, CMS has nothing to do with that. So the AMA, again, is going to look at some of those kinds of devices. They're going to look at the evidence. You have to meet evidentiary criteria to get a Category 1 CPT code. But there are a lot of products that have PMA approvals that still get a Category 3 code and live in that world for a couple of years before the specialty societies really feel that that procedure reflects a standard of care and warrants a Category 1 code. So certainly you come to the party with more, but it's not a guarantee. So, in terms of pricing, this is again where your value proposition needs to be reflected in the price. You don't want to ever underprice your technology because you really get one shot at pricing. And so reimbursement should inform your price, but it shouldn't set your price. It's part of the equation that you might use to establish. If you can create an argument about why your product should be priced more if it's a predicate to something else that's already out there, or why a new PMA device or diagnostic test is worth more because it provides a greater level of decision-making and more precision in patient outcomes, then you have a value proposition that should be reflected in your price. I mean, you should never undervalue your technology. We generally don't see that, but you also have to be realistic about what you're pricing. If you've got a piece of capital equipment that goes with your product and you want to price it at $250,000, you need to understand the level to which, again, the hospital doesn't get directly reimbursed for capital equipment. That's just overhead for them. And how many pieces of that capital are they going to really have to buy? How that's going to affect their purchasing decision relative to the reimbursement amount they're going to get on a case-by-case basis. So it's just information that you need to know. We're looking at a technology now that is potentially could replace a nuclear scan. And nuclear scans are, they don't pay a lot. This particular, the nuclear scan that this product would replace on a case-by-case basis may pay, about $300. And so what the company is doing is really very cool, and it works really well. But the cost of goods, everything is really pretty low. There's not a lot of capital there. The reason that they've looked at sort of the nuclear equipment, the capital, and they say, okay, there's a gamma camera that's a few $100,000, and then all the radiation barriers and nuclear barriers that you have to have because you're dealing with radioactive substances. They don't need any of that. You could do this test in the doctor's office, and they want to price their capital at about $250,000. And it's going to be probably a tough sell. I mean, they can do it, they can try and see if that value proposition will play. Hospitals are not going to throw away their gamma cameras in the meantime. They're not going to stop using them. There are times when you have to do a nuclear scan. So, you can't just look at what you're replacing and say, well, because they're getting that for a gamma camera, we should be able to get this for our point and shoot. And payers should pay us the difference because we bring the same value, we provide the same information for less money. And we have a panel of payers that we work with, medical directors, and they will say, why are you, the manufacturer, entitled to the savings? That's the key question. Why should I pay more for this procedure when the resources are lower, requires a lower technology-related operator? We don't need to have a radiation technologist doing this. A medical technologist could do this. We don't have to have the same level of education involved. It's safe. You don't have to have any barriers. Why should I pay more for that? So that's where your sort of value proposition has a direct conflict with resource consumption and how things are paid. And so you have to really think about all of those things when you're determining a price for your technology. And it's not enough just to say, our payer medical directors always say, nobody comes in and hands them a check, ever, for all the savings. We're all saving money. Everybody, this is going to save millions of dollars. You're never going to have to do another lung biopsy if you do the scan because we'll be able to tell it's lung cancer. Biopsy is a standard of care. People like to look at those cells under a microscope and say, yep, it's cancer. And so it takes a long time to prove that you can do what you say you're going to do. And if you really can't prove it, you have to be able to answer that so what question in the value proposition. And at the end of the day, your clinical work has to demonstrate that you are changing patient outcomes because you have added this technology into the mix. And if you can't really show that, then really is your value proposition more or is it the same? And so you have to think about what that looks like when you go to market. Do you go to market sooner or do you wait until you've done all this clinical work to demonstrate and prove this fact? I mean, it's really, these are the kinds of decisions that you have to factor in early into your business planning. And that's why, understanding sort of how you fit in the reimbursement world becomes important. Even if your product isn't something that's going to be directly or specifically reimbursed. If you have a piece of software that is going to make the hospital run more efficiently, allow systems to talk to each other, allow surgeries to happen on time so that inventory doesn't get misaccounted for, that really assure that quality measures are being met so the hospital doesn't incur penalties from payers because they haven't checked all their boxes. That's a piece of overhead. The hospital has to make a big purchase for health IT. But if it helps them save money downstream and you can demonstrate how you can make that function within their center, they're likely to buy it. So, your purchasing decisions, have to have that story about the value proposition, but it can't be just based on hearsay. You need to do the work to prove that your product does what you say it's going to do. And you have to sometimes narrow your scope. Sometimes it means that not all patients get this, but for this targeted group of patients, this really does change patient outcomes, and the hospital can make a prudent purchasing decision, or the doctor's office, or whatever facility it is, and say, okay, for this group of patients, we believe we need this more expensive catheter because we know that this group of patients is likely to suffer the following adverse events, and they're going to be back in here in 2 weeks. So we're going to spend a little more up front. And these other patients who are pretty healthy, maybe not so much. So, and then you can do a clinical trial based on that targeted group of patients rather than the universe. So, it helps you manage your money up front too, to decide you're going to have a go for the corner, then take a block strategy rather than trying to eat the world all in one bite. Right. So the question is, if payers say, why are you entitled to the savings, and why? And the question is really, why aren't you entitled to some of the savings? That's a really good question. And I don't think they're saying you're not entitled to any of the savings. You're just not entitled to all of it. And that, again, first of all, payers will tell you they don't pay for medical devices, for example. They pay for procedures. Your device may be part of that procedure, but they don't get a bill for a medical device ever. And so from their standpoint, they're paying for these procedures. They're going to pay what they pay for a procedure, and it's going to be based for private payers based on a contractual negotiation, or for the government based on some prospective payment system. And so the way the systems are designed is that the payment will increase over time, or that the hospital can go back and renegotiate a contract. And certainly the hospital can go back and renegotiate and try to get a little more money for that procedure, or may try to get some incremental funding for new technologies, even though that's pretty rare these days. And over time, payers may say, well, we're going to pay a little more for a pacemaker procedure because we know that there have been improvements to pacemakers over time. But payers aren't the ones making the decision about which pacemaker to use. They expect the doctor in the hospital to say, well, you need this pacemaker because it's going to last 20 years. It's rechargeable. Whatever it is, it's going to, and I'm making that up because there's no such thing. We're going to allow you to have the total knee that lasts 20 years because you're 40 and you've been in this terrible car accident, but you're going to live a long time. They're not going to probably, but if the doctor's looking at that 40-year-old and then they've got over here an 85-year-old who needs a total knee replacement, they don't need to have the Superman knee. So the payer's going to say, on average across the cohort of patients in my membership of, 10 million people, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, this is what we pay for a total knee replacement. And on average, everybody breaks even because we expect you, the hospital, to know who gets the Superman knee and who doesn't. And the hospital has to manage that. So when you introduce, can you imagine if everyone who introduced a new knee went to the payer and said, we want special payment for our knee? It's just, there's no way for the system to function like that. That's why you have to know who the appropriate patient is for your technology. And if you've got something that has a high value proposition, you may get some of that value back, absolutely. Right, so then how do you sell to your investors? How do you sell to people who want their money for investing in you over time? Okay, so let's take a step back and separate the purchaser and the payer for a minute, because when you think about your product, and you have a medical device? Yeah, okay, so who's the purchaser?
In our case, it would be initially through the hospital. The hospital would purchase it and then put it in the operating room.
Okay, so it's a product that's going to go into the operating room. Does it go into the patient? Does it stay in the patient?
It's a wound product, so it heals the wound and then you take it out.
Okay, so it's happening in the hospital setting, and it's part of an existing wound care procedure, I presume, like a skin graft or something like that. So you're right, there are procedure codes already. There are designated payment levels for skin graft procedures and skin substitute procedures and other wound care procedures. And payers have already aligned payments around those procedures. And you may or may not fit into those procedure codes, I don't know. And then you may or may not fit into the coverage policies that determine whether payers will even acknowledge that it's a reimbursable event. But assuming that your product does, that payment's aligned, and every patient that comes in with that condition may not get your specific product. They may not need your product. They may need a different product, or they may not be as severe, and they may get a lesser product because they're already healing, let's say. So based on that, again, the payer's job is to reimburse the procedure across cohorts of patients. It's the hospitals. The hospital's your customer. They're the ones that make the purchase, and then they make the decision that, okay, we've got patients who look like this, who need this product, and so we are going to purchase this product to treat patients who look like this. And for other patients who look like something else, they'll get a different product. And the procedure's the same, but over time and across my hospital's cohort of patients, the payment breaks in. And when the hospitals go to negotiate their contracts with private payers, and when they submit their cost reports to Medicare, with private payers, they look at their cohort of patients. They're not looking at individual patients. They're looking at that procedure, and they're saying, okay, we do 2,500 skin graft procedures a year. And on average, they cost us this. And we need to negotiate X payment to keep ourselves whole. And that's what they do. And your product should be part of that negotiation. So your job is to help the hospital understand, okay, this is the target group of patients. It's probably about 25% of the skin graft procedures that you do. It's going to cost you a little bit more because you know that these are patients who have non-healing wounds, and they're just going to keep coming back, and you're going to keep treating them, and nothing's going to work, and that costs us a lot more money. And so you're going to provide that information so that the hospital can be a smart negotiator in the future. And so that's how they grow up their payment. And and again, that's why you don't say, gee, the reimbursement rate's $114, so we're going to charge $100. You don't want the reimbursement rate to set the price. You want, but you do have to be able to make your case to the hospital about why they need to spend a little more sometimes and what they're going to get back. So in other words, when you're creating your business plan, how do you understand how much money it's going to cost you in your budget to do the planning and to file patents and other applications and things like that? Well, the good news is that the government doesn't charge you for submitting or requesting a coverage decision. Unlike FDA, where you do have to pay a lot of money, you don't have to pay the government for that, or private payers. And pretty much private payers may or may not really want to even hear from you about that. They really want to hear from the physician community about that because they're the ones that are going to be prescribing. It's really about time and planning. And you would plan for reimbursement if your product requires those kinds of things, the same way you budget marketing or budget regulatory affairs. It should be a line item in your budget, really, if it's something that your product needs. The AMA doesn't have a fee for submitting a code application, for example. Some companies do it themselves. Sometimes they hire somebody to help them do it. It does require strategy, and you need to be smart about how your application looks and when you go and what you do and who you get to help sponsor you. But all that planning becomes part of your business plan in terms of your budget. And so application fees and things like that, there really aren't any specific application fees.
For like 2 years to get this coverage.
Well, you may not need somebody all the time, for example. I mean, you may need someone to come in and out. I mean, typically, companies develop a reimbursement strategy. Some people hire someone internally. I worked for companies for a lot of years. I was an employee, and I was responsible for the whole reimbursement sort of package for the umbrella of products that the companies had. So sometimes it's someone you hire, like you hire a regulatory affairs person. Sometimes it's cheaper to hire a consultant because, especially with startups, we have clients that we work with early on to help them just know what questions to ask to get through that early round of investment and be smart in front of their investors and have that safety net. Because what you tell investors is material. You don't want to go out and tell investors incorrect information. And then, we've seen companies, because investors hire us too. And when I was working for startups, we knew the investors were going to have their own reimbursement people on the other side. So you do have to be pretty buttoned up. If you go out and tell people that, oh yeah, there's a code we can use and it's going to pay this much, and that becomes a material thing you're telling them. So you should know that that's actually factual before you put that information out there. And you can often do that on an hourly basis. It doesn't have to be a big investment. And then sometimes startup companies, go away and go back to the lab and develop their product for a while and then come back 2 years later and say, oh, we're back. We actually have something. Now we need to go to the next step. So, the reimbursement process goes in and out, and it circles around what you're doing with FDA and what you're doing with your clinical trial. So, sometimes we provide some information and advice on clinical trials and case report forms, so we're collecting good information that will support code applications and coverage decisions and things like that. And the company goes away and does the trial, and it takes a couple of years. And we don't see them again, and for a year they check in, and we may not see them again for a while. So,
Is there a range from, say, a simple 510K product to a PMA? Could you?
Like 1 million.
I mean, I know
there's not a magic, because it depends what you need. An initial assessment may be a few $1,000s, and getting a code application through its whole process could be $50. It just depends on, or you could hire somebody internally to be that person who does that work. And it's going to happen over the course of years, not necessarily all in one bite. So, many products come to us and they want to hire us to file a code application for them. And what we do is take a step back and say, well, do you know if you need a code? You may not need a code. And so, again, having that initial assessment really, once you have that initial assessment or have an idea of some of there are a lot of products that require very little from a reimbursement perspective, and some that require a whole lot. And so if you at least can identify that up front, then that will allow you to begin to scope out what this needs to look like over time in your plan.
Can you speak to that alternative? What are some of the factors that might lead you to say, maybe I don't need reimbursement, maybe I don't need a code?
Well, if you have, for example, a piece of like a software package that is really for the hospital, that makes the hospital more efficient and run more effectively, that's not something that's going to get submitted on a bill to a payer, for example. It's not something that's going to get directly reimbursed. If you've got a piece of capital equipment that's really something that exists, you've got a new ultrasound machine, for example. Ultrasound exists. If you're replacing something that already exists in the system, it may be that you don't need something new. You might be charging more, and so you obviously are going to have to make that negotiation within the hospital system, but you're not telling them to do something new that they're not already doing. So if you're in that space, or if you have a new instrument of some sort, or a device like a screw or a pin that would be used in an orthopedic surgery, those kinds of supplies don't require specific reimbursement. They don't need codes. They are part of bigger procedures that already probably have codes and are already managed within the coverage, coding, and payment universe. And what you're doing isn't going to really affect that so much.
This scenario, you bring up the hospital negotiation a lot. What about single doctors or whatever?
It's very much the same. You saw what office visits look like. Doctors bill CPT codes, so if they do procedures in their office, they get paid for those procedures. So individual devices, disposable components, things like that are not separately typically reimbursed. So you're going to fit within the procedure code payment. In those cases, you at least want to know if the doctor will be able, first of all, if it's a covered service that they're offering, if there's a code to describe it and what the payment level is. Or if you're doing something really new, does all of that need to be created? Or are you suddenly able to do this in the doctor's office when before it only existed in the hospital setting? In which case, there may not be a payment level associated with it for the doctor's office. So that just gives you a little bit of a baseline, but it's very independent based on the individual product.
You mentioned that private payers don't cover novel technology unless it is widespread, available.
Not as a blanket. They sit on it for a while to see what people are, how many doctors are asking for it.
Does it make sense early on that, for example, you go to Blue Cross Blue Shield and ask their opinion, gauge what they think about this?
Sometimes we do that. I mean, typically they don't like, I mean, payers don't really want to see manufacturers. When you hear companies say, oh yeah, I went to talk to Aetna, I went to talk to Blue, they're really not telling you the truth. That means that they went to a conference and a medical director from Aetna spoke and they got to ask one question. Payers want to hear from doctors because doctors prescribe products, doctors treat patients, doctors touch patients. You don't. Certainly you can send information into payers. They will tell you, I mean, we have a panel of payer medical directors that consult to us, and they tell us all the time, yeah, we got all this stuff in the mail, we throw it in the trash. I mean, you can certainly send all that information in. They have groups of people that do nothing but horizon, they call it horizon scanning. They see, because most stuff comes out in Europe first, so NICE in Great Britain does a very nice job of slaughtering new technologies in their health technology process, and so the payers in the United States are happy to read that. They're happy to read all the literature that comes out of Europe, especially places like Germany and Switzerland and the Netherlands, where they do very good quality clinical research. They're constantly scanning the literature to identify new technologies. They go to medical conferences. So they see what's getting presented in poster sessions. They have their eye on it all. And so it is so that's why your public face that's out there, what you put in your publications, how you design your trials, how you publicize your missteps matter, because that can be tracked over time. Once something starts to get attention, they know. And so, certainly you can try to go talk to them, but mostly you want doctors who are interested in using the technology to pick up the phone and call the medical director, because that's their customer. There are some types of software that patients access, like for speech generation on a device, for example, that may be reimbursed by some payers. Hospitals may be able to, if they have software, just because there's a code and even a payment amount for it doesn't mean that it's really going to get specifically paid by the payer. That's where coverage rules come in and payment rules come in. So without knowing more, I can't be more specific. But it's not about you saying, okay, this service, the payment amount for Medicare is $50, and you, Mr. Hospital, are going to take 30 and we're going to take 20, because you have to have a price for your technology, and it can't vary based on the payment amount. And you have to be very careful about saying, well, and for this patient, you can take 40 and we're only going to take 10, because then you're in a situation where you could be viewed as inducing or bribing a facility to use your technology inappropriately, and that's really like way against the law. So it's not about saying if the payment rate is this, we're going to take X amount of it, because what goes into that payment rate are the nursing care, the overhead, the electricity in the hospital, everything, the drugs the patient may have gotten while they were there, whatever went into that service gets wrapped into that payment. So you can't just assign yourself an amount. Well, so you have to price, again, you have to establish a separate price. Your pricing needs to be independent of the payment amount. It needs to be informed by the payment amount. And you also need to be sure that that's really an amount that the hospital is getting paid. Because most software, hospitals don't provide software. I mean, there are some software that is treated like a durable medical equipment and is paid on the DME fee schedule and has to be obtained a very specific way. And that may be how the hospital's billing it. So again, without knowing more, I can't be more specific than that. But you may be making some assumptions that are not quite on target in terms of that. But it's going to be based on the value. What are you doing, and how is that changing? But really, you need to know who's actually paying that amount. or who's getting paid. Not necessarily. This is a question about Category 3 CPT codes, which have become the default position of the AMA. When you apply for a new code, they typically want to assign a Category 3 code. And they have certainly sold it as a way that we're going to track these codes, and then it's going to provide a lot of data to show use, and that's how we're going to know it's time for a Category 1 code. The truth is that because payers decided not to cover Category 3 codes, no one's tracking them. But you can, for some hospitals, typically what it means is that doctors aren't going to get paid for doing that service. Sometimes hospitals, Medicare will assign that Category 3 code into a hospital outpatient payment classification. So there may be a payment assigned to it as long as there's coverage. And sometimes if there's not a better way of describing the technology or the procedure, it may be a strategy to go forward and get a Category 3 code and generate claims data and start, you just as a company may have to do some work to gather that information. You also then have to have a strategy for coverage. If you're going to pursue a Category 3 code, given that there are coverage implications, and specifically non-coverage implications, to have a way to assure that doctors can work with the payer to get coverage, even if it's very specific. So that not all Category 3 codes are non-covered, but you don't want to start with the coding. You need to think about the coding in the context of the coverage implications and the payment. So it's part of a strategy. Doesn't stand alone.
I have a question about the balloon atherectomy, the stent example that you brought up. Assume that, I came up with a new balloon. That is, some new ones are covered with some drugs and,
Yes, they are.
So what is my incentive to do that when there is, a fixed code? That code is only for the stent.
Well, no, it's not only for the stent, it's for everything.
Yeah, but it's fixed. It needs some time.
Well, but then maybe, I will tell you right now, the people who have made the drug-coated balloons have applied for, there are a couple of methodologies for certain types of technologies that meet very specific criteria for some additional interim payments until payments kind of catch up. Typically, you have to be truly new. You have to have a lot of evidence to show you're kind of a breakthrough. And they're applying for new codes so that the code's more specific for a drug-eluting balloon or a drug-coated balloon. So sometimes the strategy is we need not only coverage, because this is something new and breakthrough, but we need a new code to describe this and to differentiate it. And sometimes that's because that's a case where there's something different. If you were coming out with just another balloon.
Like a balloon that's like, the side effects are less, whatever. But it doesn't, unless there's a new code for it.
Because
it's
what the payment is for the balloon itself. And what the payment, on the physician side, the payment is for the work. I mean, one of the things that's happening with the drug-coated balloons is a good example, or even with the drug-coated stents compared to the bare metal stents. The work for the doctor to put that stent in is the same, irrespective of whether the stent has a drug coating or not, or the balloon has a drug coating or not. So the physician, theoretically, is doing the same work. And the physician, the hospital is buying the stent, so the doctor hasn't incurred any more in the way of resource consumption or utilization. So the doctor should get paid the same, theoretically, because the doctor's work is identical. It's the hospital that takes the risk for buying this new stent or new balloon. And there are different codes for drug-coated stent procedures versus bare metal stent procedures. So that has been differentiated.
But if it's not drug-coated, and say better material balloon or something, more bio, doesn't it save the hospital, the complications are less, the number of days?
Well, then that's your value proposition. That's how you get them to purchase it. Because if people come back because the stent broke or because there was a problem, those kind of admissions and hospitalizations and services are expensive for hospitals. They're not always really kept whole on the reimbursement amount. So that's your value proposition. That's the difference between the purchasing decision and payment. claims and cost reports. The hospitals submit cost reports. It's like a cost accounting to the payer. So the payers know that for these procedures, they've incurred these kinds of, for Medicare, the hospitals submit a cost report to Medicare, generally on a quarterly basis. So they know that there have been increases. And also, it's the claims system. You need to have that information coming in on claims so that they can see what on the claim form, the hospitals put their charges. They don't get reimbursed their charges, but that's what they put down. They have that information on a claim form, and that goes into the system, and that's what starts to accumulate the data to build the pricing over time. So on the Category 3 question, sometimes if your procedure is going to be done mostly in the hospital, and it's done adjacent to a primary procedure that's already coded and probably isn't going to be something the doctors are going to quibble over in terms of their own personal payment. If it's assigned into a payment category, that data will be tracked in the claims processing system and will start to feed the incremental payments over time. So sometimes that's where a Category 3 code could be a worthwhile process. Well, and even for a lot of new Category 1 codes, again, because of integral services and because of bundling and packaging, even if you get a new code, there is no guarantee that it will be assigned to a higher payment level or that it will not get wrapped into an existing payment category. There's never codes do not guarantee more payment. So again, that's information that would go into your code strategy is to identify what that payment world, again, what the coverage world is going to look like and what the payment world is going to look like as a result of filing that code application and getting that code.
Can you talk a little bit more about the losses associated with readmissions? There's the CMS penalties. Are there payer penalties as well in the private space?
The private payers have not really moved into that space of penalizing hospitals for readmissions. They have other ways of sort of managing that. But hospitals typically behave to the lowest common denominator, which generally is Medicare. And so Medicare has put these penalties in place for readmissions for heart failure and pneumonia, and that list will grow over time. So essentially, it's not every time you have a readmission in less than 30 days, but if the hospital incurs a high percentage of admissions and they hit a threshold, then essentially it will lower the hospital's reimbursements by a small percentage across the board. So
if we are trying to make our value proposition, are the penalties or the Medicare penalties the only numbers that we really have to go with? There's nothing equivalent from private payers?
The thing about private payers is that their payments are proprietary because they're contractual. So we don't know the terms of those contracts. So but you need to think about your patient audience. I mean, heart failure is predominantly Medicare. Pneumonia is predominantly Medicare. So those are things that matter. That's why Medicare picked them, because they are, hugely expensive for them. And they looked at the data and they say, my God, we have a 60% readmission rate for patients who have primary diagnosis of heart failure. So, certainly if you can demonstrate that by using your product in this setting and you reduce those kinds of readmissions, hospitals are interested, as long as you can prove it.
Before we take questions, I think there's plenty of people are going to have very esoteric kind of situational questions, but if you can please join me in thanking Joellen. I'm sure she'll